The wide double doors of the Branton District Courthouse swung open, revealing a grand, wood-paneled courtroom illuminated by crisp morning sunlight. Rows of pew-like benches were filled with spectators, journalists, curious locals, and even a few onlookers who had arrived out of mere fascination. They wanted to see the child attorney rumored to be representing herself in a serious legal dispute. At the center of this scene stood Jade Harrison, a poised 18-year-old dressed in a modest black blazer and neatly pressed slacks. Her thick, dark hair was pulled into a low bun, and while her appearance suggested youth, her stance conveyed remarkable confidence. She was a black teenager who held herself with a kind of calm authority that belied her age. Across the courtroom, the formidable Judge Whitmore, an older man known for his sharp tongue and often condescending demeanor, fixed Jade with an icy glare. His reputation preceded him. Attorneys dreaded his unrelenting criticism, and defendants rarely emerged unscathed. On this particular morning, Judge Whitmore was especially irritated. "Young lady," the judge said in a booming, skeptical voice, "this is a courtroom, not a high school debate club. Have you any idea the gravity of what you're attempting here?" Murmurs rippled across the gallery. Leaning forward in his imposing leather chair, the judge all but sneered down at Jade from the raised bench. Next to the judge's bench, the bailiff stood at attention, eyeing Jade as though expecting her to falter at any moment. Yet Jade did not waver. She clasped her hands behind her back, glanced briefly at her grandmother, who was sitting anxiously in the front row, and answered in a calm, measured tone, "Your Honor, I fully understand the seriousness of this proceeding. With respect, I request the opportunity to defend my position." The prosecution's team let out quiet snickers. More than one lawyer exchanged knowing looks, certain this was about to be one of the shortest, most humiliating hearings in local history. But Jade's gaze remained fixed on the judge, refusing to bow to the tide of doubt around her. Judge Whitmore leaned back and gave a dismissive laugh. "You want to defend yourself in this matter?" His voice, dripping with condescension, echoed across the silent courtroom. A child playing make-believe as an attorney. "We don't have time for games." Suddenly, Jade produced a neatly organized binder and placed it on the table in front of her. "Your Honor," she said, "I've prepared a detailed analysis of the prosecution's claims, including relevant case precedents. I believe once you see it, you'll understand that I have every right and the necessary credentials to argue in my own defense." The hush that fell over the courtroom was electric. No one moved. Even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback. That was the moment the entire mood in the courtroom shifted, pivoting from smug amusement to something much more charged, an incredulous sense that they might be witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. But before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have more inspiring stories coming your way tomorrow. Now, let's begin this incredible journey together. To understand Jade Harrison's journey, one must return to Greenwood Park, a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Baltimore, where she lived with her grandmother, Helen Harrison. The single-story home was simple and well-kept. A small garden out front offered fresh herbs and vegetables, tended carefully by Helen, a retired schoolteacher. Jade's mother had passed away when she was very young, and her father had never been in the picture. Helen became her primary guardian, instilling in Jade the values of compassion, perseverance, and humility. She also provided Jade with an endless supply of books on history, science, classical literature, and later law. At 7, Jade had grown bored with fairy tales and bedtime stories, sneaking glances at Helen's old textbooks and reading them under the covers by flashlight. By 12, Jade was devouring law journals, analyzing Supreme Court rulings, and scribbling notes in the margins. She entered a debate competition for local high schoolers at 13 and single-handedly dismantled a team of well-prepared seniors, leaving them in stunned disbelief. Yet Jade did not crave attention. If anything, she was happiest reading in her grandmother's garden or volunteering at the local community center's legal clinic, where she fetched coffee and filed paperwork for attorneys who took pro bono cases. Her brilliance was a fact she acknowledged, not one she flaunted. Helen often told Jade, "Your gifts won't mean anything unless you use them to help people who can't help themselves." This message resonated deeply in Jade. She dreamed of becoming an attorney, of defending those who were overlooked by society. And she was well on her way, though hardly anyone beyond Helen knew just how far she had progressed. When Jade turned 16, she secretly passed the bar exam in a special legal arrangement that allowed exceptional individuals to sit for it under strict conditions. Few believed such a scenario was even possible, but Jade's test scores left no room for doubt. She had, for all intents and purposes, become one of the state's youngest licensed attorneys. Though the official documentation was sealed by the court at Helen's request to protect Jade from media frenzy. Now, at 18, Jade had chosen to reveal her status under the most unusual of circumstances, by representing herself in a high-stakes legal matter that threatened to derail her future if she failed. A week before Jade's court date, she had overheard Alicia Carter, a struggling single mother, in tears at the small corner store. Alicia had 2 young sons, a minimum wage job at a local diner, and a landlord on a mission to evict her, Mr. Brody, a man Jade would come to know all too well. Jade had just stepped inside the store to buy milk for her grandmother when she caught Alicia's sobbing voice. "He's raising the rent for no reason," Alicia managed to explain to the sympathetic store cashier. "I've never missed a payment, but he claims I've violated my lease. I don't have anywhere to go if he kicks us out." As the cashier awkwardly consoled Alicia, Jade felt a flare of indignation. She recognized the pattern. Unscrupulous landlords often concocted bogus reasons to evict tenants, hoping to bring in wealthier renters willing to pay inflated prices. Out in the parking lot, Jade introduced herself softly. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but I overheard your conversation. Maybe I can help." Alicia stared at her, eyes puffy. "Look, I appreciate it, but you're just a kid. How can you possibly help me?" Jade had grown used to this reaction. Still, she handed Alicia a scrap of paper with her phone number. "I'm no ordinary kid. Call me if you want to explore your options. I promise, I can point you in the right direction." Alicia looked uncertain, but something about Jade's confidence made her pocket the number. 2 days later, Alicia showed up at Jade's doorstep with a shoebox full of rent receipts and a copy of her lease. Nervously, she apologized. "I'm sorry, this is so strange. I just didn't know where else to turn." Inviting her in, Jade spent the entire afternoon examining every document meticulously. Mr. Brody's eviction notice cited questionable violations, excessive noise, additional occupants, unsanitary conditions, none of which Alicia recognized as true. Jade sensed a pattern of fabricated claims. With her grandmother's gentle encouragement from the sidelines, Jade proposed a bold solution. "We'll send a formal demand letter," Jade said. "We'll outline exactly why his claims are baseless. If he doesn't back down, we take him to court." Jade wrote the letter and mailed it via certified delivery, ensuring Mr. Brody's signature was required. 2 weeks later, Alicia called Jade in a panic, reading aloud a new notice from the landlord. "I am within my rights to remove you, Ms. Carter, as you have violated your lease terms. Any attempt to challenge my decision will result in legal repercussions." Alicia's hands shook as she held the paper. "He's threatening to sue me? I can't afford a lawyer, Jade. I barely scrape by every month as it is." Jade's expression hardened. "Then we'll file a claim in small claims court and challenge him. Let me see if I can represent you. In most states, you don't need an attorney in small claims court." But Alicia was petrified of facing the system alone. "Represent me?" she echoed, still in disbelief that a teenager was offering. Jade only smiled. "I've spent years studying the law. Trust me, if we do this right, we can win." Uncertain but out of options, Alicia agreed. Before Jade knew it, local word spread. A teenage girl was about to take on a known landlord in court. The neighbors, who disliked Mr. Brody's harsh tactics, rallied behind Alicia. Some donated small amounts to help with filing fees. Others offered moral support. But not everyone was convinced. "This is madness," Alicia's co-worker had warned her. "You'll lose the case and end up owing thousands in fees." Despite the naysayers, Alicia clung to Jade's quiet confidence. When the hearing day arrived, a line stretched down the courthouse hallway. Curiosity was at an all-time high. Reporters, amateur bloggers, and random spectators gathered to watch the so-called child lawyer. Alicia's anxiety was palpable. She clutched a folder of her documents, knuckles white from tension. Inside the small courtroom, the air was thick with expectancy. A few older attorneys in wrinkled suits exchanged smirks, clearly anticipating comedic relief from Jade's performance. Then Judge Whitmore entered. Jade had read about Judge Whitmore's fierce reputation and braced herself. He surveyed the room. His eyes landed on Jade and Alicia at the plaintiff's table. "Who is representing Miss Carter?" he asked. His voice echoed in the hush. Jade stood. "I am, Your Honor." A hush fell as the judge examined Jade's youthful face. With a quirked eyebrow, he tapped his gavel. "You're telling this court you're an attorney?" Jade's heart pounded, but she kept her composure. "I am licensed, yes. I'd be happy to present proof if it pleases the court." A ripple of disbelief washed over the spectators. Mr. Brody's lawyer, Mr. Larson, let out a derisive snort. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he said, turning to Jade with an incredulous stare. The judge cleared his throat, an edge of annoyance creeping into his tone. "Let's see your credentials, Miss Harrison," Jade replied, stepping forward to hand over a copy of her bar admission documentation along with a letter from the State Bar Association confirming her status. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge as he scanned the paper. Slowly, the color drained from his face. He looked up half in shock. "Where in the world? Miss Harrison, you passed the bar last year?" Jade nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I kept it sealed to maintain my privacy, but it's valid." Collective gasps reverberated around the courtroom. Mr. Larson's jaw hung open, and Mr. Brody, the landlord, scowled in disbelief. The judge cleared his throat again. It was apparent he hadn't expected to be caught off guard. "This is highly unusual," he said, half to himself. "But if your credentials check out, I see no reason to bar you from representing Ms. Carter." Jade seized the moment. "Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed with our opening argument?" Glances of baffled admiration flickered among the onlookers. Even reporters who had arrived hoping for a comedic fiasco were now scribbling furiously in their notepads, realizing they might be witnessing legal history in the making. Without missing a beat, Jade laid out Alicia's situation, presenting meticulously organized receipts and lease agreements. She cited local housing ordinances and illustrated how Mr. Brody had systematically raised rents and filed dubious violations to clear out long-term tenants. The clarity and precision of her argument belied her youth, mesmerizing the courtroom. Mr. Larson attempted to interject multiple times, claiming irrelevance or hearsay, but Jade rebuffed him with solid citations. In the 2014 case of Townsend versus Miller, Your Honor, the court found that unsubstantiated lease violations issued en masse can constitute bad faith eviction. Judge Whitmore, who had started the day mocking Jade, was now listening intently. He pressed his lips together, possibly suppressing his surprise. When Jade finally concluded, she quietly returned to her seat. Alicia, wide-eyed, whispered, "How did you learn all that? That was amazing." A modest smile tugged at Jade's lips. "I love to read, and this is the perfect place to put that reading to work." Then it was Mr. Larson's turn. He railed against Alicia, painting her as a disruptive tenant who'd repeatedly broken the lease. But in cross-examination, Jade politely but relentlessly exposed the inconsistencies in the landlord's story. "Yes, Mr. Larson," Jade said, her voice calm. "Can you confirm the exact date Ms. Carter allegedly caused these excessive noise disturbances? Because our evidence shows she was working double shifts that week." An uncomfortable pause. Mr. Larson fumbled for paperwork that didn't exist. Every detail Jade had meticulously prepared undermined his claims. By the lunch recess, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. A few hours later, the judge announced the day's proceedings concluded, promising a ruling at the next session. The room erupted in conversation. Half the spectators rushed forward, shouting questions at Jade or snapping her photo. Alicia tried to shield Jade from the chaotic crowd, but they were pinned by a barrage of questions. "How does it feel to be the youngest attorney in the state?" Did you really pass the bar at 16? What made you take on this case? Jade felt her face grow warm. She spotted her grandmother, Helen, in the gallery, smiling gently to reassure her. But Jade also saw the landlord, Mr. Brody, glowering, his knuckles white as he clenched his briefcase. That ominous scowl was a warning. The battle was far from over. That evening, after returning home, Jade was poring over legal notes when Helen knocked softly on her bedroom door. "You did wonderfully today," Helen said, entering with 2 cups of tea. "But I worry. You know how people can react when their power is challenged." Jade took the tea gratefully, forcing a brave smile. "I can handle it, Grandma, especially if it means helping Alicia and others like her." Helen placed a gentle hand on Jade's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, but be cautious. Remember, some people don't fight fair." Jade nodded, recalling the venomous glare Mr. Brody had given her in court. Yet she pushed the memory aside, determined to focus on the final hearing that would determine Alicia's fate. Days later, Jade received a call late at night, an unknown number. A chilling voice rasped on the line. "Back off, girl. You think you're smart, but you're a child stepping into grown folks' business. You keep this up, it won't end well for you." Jade's heart thundered, but her voice remained steady. "Who is this?" The caller hung up. She stared at the phone in silence for a long moment, an uneasy mixture of fear and resolve twisting in her stomach. She knew well that Mr. Brody had resources, friends in powerful places, a team of unscrupulous associates. She also knew that cowering was exactly what they wanted. In the end, Jade laid her phone aside, took a deep breath, and returned to her legal briefs. Fear would not deter her. Not now. When the next court date arrived, Jade was ready to present closing arguments on Alicia's behalf. However, Mr. Larson dramatically announced new evidence that would supposedly prove Alicia had been hosting unauthorized boarders in her apartment, a direct lease violation. He brandished a stack of photographs and typed statements. Jade's eyes narrowed as she looked at the so-called evidence. The images were grainy, showing individuals entering the building, but it was impossible to tell which unit they were accessing. The statements were even more suspicious. They bore questionable notary stamps and vague, identical wording. Judge Whitmore frowned, flipping through the pages. "These documents," he said to Mr. Larson. "When did you come across them?" Mr. Larson stammered. "Recently, Your Honor, we, have reason to believe Ms. Carter withheld this information." Jade calmly requested permission to examine the evidence more thoroughly. The judge granted a brief recess. Huddled in a quiet corner with Alicia, Jade pored over each page, a sense of indignation rising. She recognized multiple inconsistencies. One affidavit was signed by an alleged neighbor claiming Alicia regularly invited 4 or 5 unrelated adults to stay overnight. But the signature style and date alignment were obviously off, and the notary's seal was from a different county entirely. Another sworn statement was from a so-called apartment handyman, yet it used identical phrasing as the neighbor's statement. "This is all fake," Jade muttered. "But we need proof." Alicia, close to tears, whispered, "They're doing everything they can to make me look like a liar. Who's going to believe us?" Jade set her jaw. "Trust me, we'll tear this apart on the stand." The hearing resumed. Jade took a slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand where the so-called apartment handyman, Daniel Meyer, had just testified that he frequently saw random strangers entering Alicia's unit. "Mr. Meyer," Jade began, her polite smile barely concealing an undercurrent of steel, "you stated you visited Ms. Carter's apartment every Thursday at noon to fix maintenance issues, correct?" He nodded stiffly. "Yes, that's correct." She flipped through a record of Alicia's work schedule. "Are you aware Ms. Carter works a shift from 7 a.m. until 3 p.m. every Thursday at Bob's Diner?" His eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Well, I might have the days mixed up." "I see," Jade replied, turning another page. "So, perhaps it was another day each week? Because according to maintenance logs from the property manager system, your last official work order for Ms. Carter's unit was 6 months ago, on a Monday. Care to comment?" A hush fell over the room. Mr. Meyer squirmed under Jade's unrelenting gaze. "Well, memory can be fuzzy. That's understandable." Jade said, her voice gentle yet unwavering. But you did sign an affidavit declaring these visits occurred consistently on Thursdays, noon sharp. So either the logs are inaccurate, or you are, Mr. Meyer. Which is it? Stammering, he muttered something incoherent. Judge Whitmore watched with growing curiosity. After a pause, Jade moved in for the finishing blow. In your statement, she continued, you also claim Ms. Carter was harboring up to 5 additional tenants. Did you document their names or any proof they resided there? He shook his head. No, but I saw them. Yet there is no photographic or documented evidence beyond your statement? Jade pressed. None of these alleged tenants have been identified or approached for comment? No, the man's voice wavered, trailing off. Jade calmly handed the judge copies of the logs and Alicia's work schedule. Your Honor, there are glaring inconsistencies. This witness's claims rest entirely on memory, yet they conflict with verified records. We respectfully request the court dismiss his testimony as unreliable. Judge Whitmore peered over the top of his spectacles. Mr. Larson, do you have any further corroboration for Mr. Meyer's claims? Mr. Larson blustered. Your Honor, we should be given time to rectify these discrepancies. The witness only came forward recently. The judge lifted a hand to silence him. Enough. We will proceed with caution regarding this testimony. Jade's cross-examination spree continued, exposing similar flaws in the other witness statements. She systematically dismantled Mr. Larson's claims until it became clear the so-called new evidence was a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse. Outside the courthouse, Alicia's relief was palpable. I can't believe how they all fell apart under questioning, she gasped. Jade, I'd be lost without you. Jade offered a reassuring nod. We're not done yet, but we made progress. They keep throwing everything at us, which means we must be close to the truth. Reporters again swarmed them, hurling questions about Jade's astonishing skills. Microphones and cameras closed in, snapping pictures. Alicia, uneasy with the spotlight, looked to Jade for guidance. We'll give a quick statement, Jade whispered to Alicia. Then, raising her voice for the cameras, we're confident in Ms. Carter's position. Today's proceedings show that truth is on our side. We'll be back in court soon, and we expect a fair outcome. Among the crowd, Jade caught a glimpse of a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, standing off to one side with an unsettlingly calm expression. He offered no microphone, no camera, just a stare that cut through the sea of people. Jade felt a chill. Something told her he was no mere bystander. Later that evening, Jade was tidying her binder of case files at the small desk in her bedroom when she received a text from an unknown number. We should talk. Meet me behind the courthouse tomorrow at 8 a.m. Her brow furrowed. Could this be the same person who would phone her at night? It seemed likely. Though the text was cryptic, Jade felt a compulsion to face whatever threat was looming. She needed to protect Alicia's case. The next morning, Jade arrived at the deserted alley behind the courthouse, well before the building opened for the day. The swirling sounds of city traffic were muffled between tall brick walls. She wrapped her blazer tighter against the early morning chill. Sure enough, the same tall man she'd noticed outside the courthouse emerged from behind a parked SUV. He introduced himself with a low, almost mocking tone. Vince Carraway, private investigator, he said, leaning casually on the hood of the vehicle. Mr. Brody has me on retainer. Jade's eyes flashed. So, you're the one behind the phone calls? He smirked. Don't take it personally, kid. My job is to get you off Mr. Brody's back. Despite a flutter of fear, Jade maintained an even expression. Intimidation won't make me drop the case. He shrugged. Could be worse than intimidation. You're messing with powerful interests. You're too young to understand how the system really works. I understand enough, Jade retorted, stepping forward. I understand Mr. Brody's entire enterprise is built on exploiting people like Alicia Carter. And I understand that if I quit, you'll just keep preying on families who can't fight back. Vince's smirk twisted into something more predatory. Last warning, kid. You're in over your head. Then do your worst, Jade shot back, turning on her heel. Because I'm not giving up. As she walked away, she felt his eyes burning into her back. The hair on her arms prickled, but fear, she reminded herself, was exactly what they wanted. She would not yield. Days rolled by, and Jade's life became a whirlwind of legal research, new evidence, and private detective antics from Vince. She barely slept more than a few hours at night, fueled by the drive to expose Mr. Brody's deeper scheme. Working late with her grandmother's old laptop, Jade stumbled upon a labyrinth of shell companies tied to Brody. One was called Zenith Allies, a consulting firm that suspiciously owned several other vacant properties throughout the city. It appeared to be registered under a fake address and managed by a web of corporate proxies. She enlisted the help of a tech-savvy friend, Troy Bauer, a college sophomore majoring in cybersecurity. Troy's face lit with intrigue when Jade explained the situation over the phone. "Sounds like you're dealing with a real estate ring. Let me see what I can find." Within days, Troy discovered Zenith Allies was used to funnel money from questionable sources, possibly rent gouging operations and tax evasion schemes. Mr. Brody's name appeared on internal records as a senior consultant. "This is big, Jade," Troy told her, sending encrypted documents. "If we connect Mr. Brody's actions against Alicia Carter to his shady holdings, we can show a pattern of exploitative behavior. That could lead to serious criminal charges." Jade felt exhilaration and dread mix in her chest. Exposing Brody's empire might protect Alicia for good, but it would also raise the stakes and potentially put them all at greater risk. 1 week before the final hearing, Jade stepped into the courthouse to file additional evidence linking Zenith Allies to Brody. To her surprise, she found Mr. Larson already there, sporting a self-assured grin. "We're filing a countersuit," he announced, handing a thick folder of documents to the clerk. "Defamation and malicious prosecution. Ms. Carter's baseless accusations have harmed Mr. Brody's reputation beyond repair." Jade's stomach turned. A countersuit could drag Alicia through even more turmoil. Legal fees, stress, possible judgments. Mr. Larson must have sensed her unease because his smug grin widened. The clerk processed the paperwork. Jade quickly requested copies. Once alone, she flipped through the new complaints allegations. They claimed Alicia and her teen attorney had fabricated evidence, incited a media frenzy, and caused Mr. Brody significant emotional and financial losses. That evening, Alicia showed up at Jade's home in tears. "What does this mean?" she asked. "I can't afford to pay damages if we lose. I can barely feed my kids." Jade tried to reassure her. "It's a scare tactic. They're hoping you'll back down. We won't let that happen." Still, the strain on Alicia was obvious. Jade hugged her and promised to do everything in her power to protect her. In the days leading up to trial, Jade juggled mounting evidence for Alicia's initial eviction defense and the new countersuit. The press coverage intensified. Some outlets championed Jade as a teen wonder, while others ridiculed the spectacle of a minor outsmarting veteran attorneys. Helen, worried about Jade's health, begged her to rest. But Jade was consumed with research. She had Troy digging deeper into Brody's finances, searching for anything to refute the defamation claims. Late one night, Troy called with a breakthrough. "Jade, I found a chain of emails from Zenith Allies discussing evictions at multiple properties, specifically mentioning plans to raise rents after the low-income tenants are out. They name Alicia Carter's unit directly. This is huge. It proves Brody's motive. I'll send it over." A wave of relief crashed over Jade. With these emails, they could show that Mr. Brody had planned all along to push Alicia out to raise prices. The defamation suit would look like a desperate attempt at retaliation, yet there was no time to celebrate. Jade double and triple-checked the authenticity of the emails to ensure they'd stand up in court. She had Troy notarize a chain of custody record and bring in a digital forensics specialist to affirm the emails were genuine. Finally, the final hearing arrived. The courthouse was besieged by reporters and spectators. People thronged the halls, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jade or glean any inside information. Over the last weeks, Alicia's story had captured public sympathy. Local news stations ran segments on the unstoppable teen lawyer and the single mother fighting to keep a roof over her children's heads. Inside the courtroom, tension vibrated through the air like static electricity. Judge Whitmore took his seat, scanning the crowd with a stern expression. The court first heard motions regarding the newly filed countersuit. Mr. Larson stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, we intend to prove that Ms. Carter and Ms. Harrison engaged in a coordinated campaign of defamation. We have affidavits and statements. Judge Whitmore's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Let's see them. Mr. Larson handed up documents, but Jade noted they contained many of the same questionable signatures from earlier testimonies. This time, she was ready. When it was her turn, Jade respectfully approached the bench. Your Honor, we have evidence showing Mr. Brody intended to evict Ms. Carter to renovate her apartment and increase rent. This was part of a larger scheme, orchestrated through his association with a shell company called Zenith Allies. We also have reason to believe these so-called affidavits are from individuals with financial ties to Mr. Brody. She submitted Troy's meticulously compiled report. A hush blanketed the courtroom as the bailiff passed the thick binder to Judge Whitmore. Jade called Troy Bauer to the stand as an expert witness in digital forensics. Though young, only in his early 20s, Troy exuded calm expertise, explaining step by step how he traced the emails and documents to confirm they originated from Zenith Allies. Mr. Larson tried to dismiss Troy's testimony as hacker speak, but Troy confidently pointed to the IP logs and domain ownership records. Judge Whitmore listened, at times leaning forward with keen interest. The references to conspiracy, shell companies, and fraudulent eviction notices seemed to paint a stark picture of how Brody systematically exploited tenants. Meanwhile, Alicia clung to Jade's arm under the table, tears of anxious hope in her eyes. Once Troy finished, Jade pressed further. Now, regarding the countersuit, we have no record of Ms. Carter or myself initiating any defamation campaign beyond reporting an alleged unlawful eviction to the court. If the defense has evidence to the contrary, we'd be happy to review it. Mr. Larson looked cornered. He tried to pivot, but Jade followed up with more questions, revealing each affidavit to be linked to either a Brody-run property or the suspect notary from outside the county. The cumulative effect was devastating. One final blow arrived when Jade submitted an email chain in which Mr. Brody explicitly wrote to an associate, "We need Carter out by the end of the month. Make something up if you have to. Our buyers want the unit vacated ASAP." Judge Whitmore's face darkened as he read the line. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers, swiftly silenced by the pound of his gavel. As if on cue, two stern-faced officials from the state attorney's office entered the courtroom. The lead investigator stepped forward, announcing that an ongoing investigation into Mr. Brody's real estate dealings had been escalated due to newly uncovered evidence of fraud and racketeering. A hush descended. Again, and a wave of camera shutters clicked among the attending press. Mr. Brody himself, already sweating under the collar, grew deathly pale. He exchanged frantic whispers with Mr. Larson. The judge allowed the officials to approach the defense table. A hush fell as an arrest warrant was produced. "Mr. Conrad Brody," the lead investigator said, "we are taking you into custody on suspicion of fraud, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of unlawful eviction practices." Outrage flared in Brody's eyes. "This is a setup," he shouted, trying to stand, but the officials quickly handcuffed him. The murmuring in the room grew louder as cameras clicked and onlookers craned their necks to see the landlord escorted away. Mr. Larson, left at the defense table, looked as though his world had just collapsed. He mumbled about withdrawing from the case, but Judge Whitmore rapped his gavel twice. With Brody gone, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "Order! We still have a matter to resolve: Ms. Carter's eviction and the countersuit. Given the arrest and the evidence of fraudulent activity, it is this court's position that the eviction notice was baseless and malicious in nature. Therefore, the eviction is denied, and Ms. Carter may remain in her apartment. Additionally, the countersuit is summarily dismissed. I see no merit in continuing with these frivolous claims." He paused to let the hush settle. "Furthermore," he added, "I find it appropriate to recommend that Mr. Brody's activities be fully investigated by the district attorney's office." This hearing is adjourned. A cheer erupted from Alicia's supporters in the gallery. Journalists scrambled to record the final statements. Alicia burst into tears, hugging Jade so fiercely that the girl almost lost her balance. Even Judge Whitmore, who had once belittled Jade, gave her a measured nod as he stood to leave the bench. In one swift moment, Alicia's livelihood was saved, the countersuit quashed, and Mr. Brody's empire of exploitation began to crumble under legal scrutiny. But for Jade, this was more than a personal victory. It was the validation of everything she had worked for. She had proven her competence not just to the legal system, but to a community desperately in need of a champion. The days following the courtroom spectacle were a blur. Cameras and microphones followed Jade outside the courthouse. Headlines read, "Teen legal prodigy defeats corrupt landlord Carter family, saved from unlawful eviction. Shocking arrest ends Brody's scheme." Helen, Jade's grandmother, watched from their living room in awe as local news channels replayed clips of the hearing. Neighbors dropped by with congratulations, some bringing homemade baked goods or cards. A local radio station invited Jade for an interview, praising her courage beyond her years. Alicia Carter, at last able to breathe without fearing eviction, expressed her gratitude by cooking a huge meal for Helen and Jade. Her children, shy at first, gave Jade hand-drawn thank you notes covered in bright crayon hearts. "I can never repay you," Alicia said tearfully, hugging Jade by the front door. "But I want you to know, my family owes you our home, our stability, and our hope." Jade blushed under the praise. "I only did what any lawyer should," she said, "but I'm so happy you and your kids can finally feel safe." Despite the applause and accolades, Jade felt that the real challenge was just beginning. As she scrolled through her phone late one night, countless messages poured in from strangers facing similar struggles. Some were families threatened by eviction. Others were youths inspired by Jade's story, asking how they too could stand up for their rights. The flood of pleas and personal stories both excited and overwhelmed her. She realized that Mr. Brody was just one of many powerful landlords exploiting vulnerable tenants. A system allowed it to happen. If she wanted to make a larger impact, she'd have to keep fighting. That night, Jade confided in Helen. "Maybe I'm not ready for the big stage yet," Jade admitted. "I'm only 18. There's so much I don't know." Helen cupped Jade's cheek gently. "You have a gift, Jade. The knowledge, the courage to stand up for others. Those things can't be taught in a classroom. I believe you're exactly where you're meant to be." A few days after the case's conclusion, Jade received an email from the Branton Housing Alliance, a small nonprofit that helped tenants in crisis. They invited her to speak at a community event on renters' rights. Jade hesitated. She wasn't a fan of the spotlight, but the idea of sharing her knowledge to empower others was too important to turn down. When the day arrived, Jade stood in front of a modest group of about 40 people in the basement of a local church, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Most were working-class tenants, single mothers, and retirees living on fixed incomes. As Jade spoke, explaining basic tenants' rights, how to file complaints, and what to do if facing an unlawful eviction, she saw hope spark in their eyes. A young mother approached after the talk. "Miss Harrison, you're an inspiration. Because of you, I realize I can fight back too." Jade managed a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. And please call me Jade." From that point on, word of mouth spread. Other nonprofits asked her to speak or volunteer at legal workshops. She even started a small pro bono project from her grandmother's living room, using Helen's battered coffee table as her makeshift desk. Jade called it the Tenants Defense Project, a venture to guide people who couldn't afford traditional legal fees. Meanwhile, the investigations into Mr. Brody's finances deepened. Troy's discovery about Zenith Allies led authorities to freeze multiple accounts, bringing to light a chain of dubious property transactions. Former tenants of Brody's buildings emerged with their own horror stories of intimidation, hidden fees, and forced evictions. With the media's spotlight on Jade's case, authorities felt pressure to follow through. But not everyone was celebrating Jade's success. Late one evening, while leaving a community center legal clinic, Jade walked alone down a dimly lit side street. The echo of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the deserted concrete. Suddenly, a sleek black sedan pulled up alongside her. The passenger window rolled down, revealing the cold eyes of Vince Carraway. "You just couldn't let things go, could you?" he said in a low voice. "Brody's facing charges, and you're making waves. If I were you, I'd mind my own business from now on." Jade's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. "If you're here to threaten me again, it won't work. Brody is done. You might want to consider whether it's worth staying in his corner." Vince let out a mirthless laugh. "You think this ends with him? The city's full of men like Brody. Rich, powerful, willing to pay me a lot more to keep people like you silent." His eyes flicked over her, calculating. "Don't push your luck, Jade Harrison. You're not invincible." Before she could respond, he sped off, tires screeching on the asphalt. Jade stood there for a long moment, adrenaline coursing through her. She realized she was trembling. This was the first time she genuinely feared for her safety. Yet that fear solidified her resolve. People like Vince thrived on intimidation. She would meet them with unwavering determination to protect the people who needed it most. As the weeks turned into months, Jade's influence in the fight for housing justice expanded. Volunteers from local colleges, inspired by Jade's story, joined her tenants' defense project. Some were law students looking to gain hands-on experience. Others were social work students eager to connect tenants to critical resources. Alicia Carter also became an invaluable ally. Freed from the looming eviction, she had enough emotional bandwidth to help others. She spoke at local events, sharing her story of triumph thanks to Jade's representation. She accompanied Jade to rallies demanding that city officials pass more protective housing ordinances. Helen watched it all with pride. Her modest home became a bustling hub of activism. Phones ringing, laptops whirring, piles of documents spread across every table. Jade apologized often for the chaos, but Helen would only smile and say, "This is exactly what this house was meant for, a place of sanctuary and change." Local news highlighted Jade's achievements. The headline, "Teen Attorney Sparks Tenants' Rights Revolution," circulated. Though Jade never liked the sensationalism, she couldn't deny that media attention helped bring more resources to the cause. Following Brody's downfall, the case spurred a chain reaction. Dozens of pending eviction suits filed by other landlords came under new scrutiny. Many questionable practices were unearthed, from forged documents to unrecorded rent hikes. City council members, previously uninterested in housing issues, now held emergency meetings to discuss legislation against exploitative evictions. Jade found herself invited to testify at a council hearing. Nervous but resolute, she carefully presented her findings. Pattern of fraudulent claims. Some landlords, like Brody, invented lease violations to remove lower-paying tenants. Inflated rent hikes. Immediately after evictions, units were renovated minimally and relisted at exorbitant rates. Illegal loopholes. State laws allowed indefinite delays, giving landlords time to harass tenants into leaving voluntarily. Council members, some of whom had close ties to real estate developers, fidgeted in their seats, perhaps uneasy about Jade's pointed revelations. Others seemed genuinely concerned, taking copious notes. Ultimately, the council debated proposals for a new Tenant Protection Act. While the legislative process would be slow, Jade felt proud to have sparked a serious conversation at the highest level of local government. Of course, with growing influence came growing resistance. The landlord lobby began a smear campaign, hinting that Jade was an attention seeker who exploited a legal loophole to become an attorney at such a young age. Some tried to discredit her bar credentialing process, calling for the state bar to re-examine her status. Late one afternoon, Jade received a letter from the State Bar Association stating they'd opened a formal inquiry into her unusual admission circumstances. She felt a spike of panic. Could they revoke her license? All her work, Alicia's victory, the new cases she was helping with, hinged on that piece of paper's validity. Helen comforted her, reminding Jade that her exam results were undeniable. Jade had passed through legitimate channels, no matter how unconventional. "You let them investigate," Helen said gently. "They'll find you're genuine." When word got out about the inquiry, supporters bombarded the Bar Association with letters, phone calls, and petitions praising Jade's integrity. Even Judge Whitmore, who had done a 180 in his opinion of Jade, wrote a letter attesting to her skill and compliance with court protocols. 2 months later, the bar inquiry concluded in Jade's favor. She was cleared of any suspicion, and the association publicly recognized her extraordinary competence and commitment to ethical practice. It was a victory that only fueled her standing in the eyes of the public. Jade began traveling to neighboring counties, hosting free legal aid workshops. The grassroots movement she seeded at home was morphing into a statewide network for tenant advocacy. She connected with established nonprofits, forging alliances to address issues like gentrification, slumlord practices, and the housing shortage. At one workshop in Grantham County, Jade met an elderly couple, the Alvarezes, who faced eviction after living in their home for 40 years. Their landlord claimed he needed to renovate, but Jade's quick inspection revealed the property was already in decent condition. Another ploy to raise rents by displacing loyal tenants. Over the next month, Jade, with the help of local volunteers, halted the eviction by exposing the landlord's contradictory renovation statements to the local housing board. Each win reinforced Jade's mission. Yet every victory also rattled wealthy owners. Threatening calls still came. Sometimes her mailbox contained anonymous letters telling her to get lost, little girl, or you'll regret messing with us. Jade turned them over to authorities, but pressed on. One crisp autumn day, Jade received intel that Vince Carraway, the menacing investigator, had been hired by a coalition of landlords. They planned to launch a lawsuit claiming Jade's Tenants Defense Project was practicing law without a license in multiple counties. It was a bizarre argument, given Jade was licensed in the entire state, but they intended to argue that volunteers under her direction were effectively offering legal advice illegally. Upset but resolute, Jade prepared for a legal fight to defend her project. The hearing on the matter convened in a different courthouse with a different judge, a stoic woman named Judge Redding. Carraway was there, seated alongside a cluster of stiffly suited attorneys representing the landlord coalition. They presented reams of documents, attempting to show Jade's volunteers had stepped beyond permissible administrative assistance. The mood in the courtroom was tense. If the coalition succeeded, Jade's entire network could be shut down. She'd be forced to operate strictly as a single attorney, drastically limiting the help she could offer. But Jade was ready. She outlined the exact roles of her volunteers: paralegals under supervision, law students merely conducting research, community liaisons referring tenants to licensed counsel. She emphasized that she was the one actually practicing law, with direct oversight of every case. Judge Redding took a week to deliberate. The tension was agonizing as Jade waited. Then the decision was handed down in a neatly typed order. The Tenants Defense Project was operating lawfully under Jade's supervision, and the court saw no grounds to disband it. She had effectively shut down the coalition's challenge. As the coalition attorneys sulked away, Vince Carraway offered Jade a cold, tight-lipped nod. This time, she returned it with unflinching confidence. She had faced yet another giant and prevailed. In the following months, Jade's activism soared. She championed new legislation, personally testified before state committees, and connected tenants across different cities. Alicia Carter often stood beside her, telling her own story as living proof that no one should be dismissed or underestimated based on age, background, or finances. Mr. Brody's trial resulted in convictions on several counts. He faced hefty fines, restitution, and jail time. News outlets followed the story until it faded into the background. Just another cautionary tale of greed. But for Jade and the tenants he exploited, his downfall was a turning point that catalyzed a broader movement for reform. Back home in Greenwood Park, Helen watched with quiet satisfaction as her granddaughter blossomed, not just into a formidable lawyer, but into a leader. Often, Helen would reminisce about the little girl who read law books under the bedsheets. Now that little girl was forging real change in the world. When Jade turned 19, the entire neighborhood threw a surprise party in the same community center where Alicia Carter had once sobbed over losing her apartment. This time, the mood was jubilant. Helen got teary-eyed as local residents showered Jade with gratitude. By 20, Jade expanded her organization into the Harrison Legal Collective, formally registering it as a nonprofit with a team of dedicated attorneys and staff. Grants and donations began streaming in. She traveled to conferences, delivered keynote speeches on youth empowerment, and even mentored other teens aspiring to challenge the status quo. Late one night, after a particularly long day of hearing cases and fielding calls, Jade sat alone in the dim glow of the collective's office. Rows of legal books lined the walls. Pinned to a corkboard were clippings of successful eviction defenses, photos of families she'd helped, and heartfelt thank you notes drawn in crayon. She pulled out a file labeled Carter versus Brody. Inside were all the original documents: Alicia's lease, the eviction notices, Jade's own bar certification, and the transcripts from those dramatic court days. Reading through them, Jade felt a wave of nostalgia and disbelief at how much had changed since then. She recalled the moment Judge Whitmore first sneered at her, how her stomach had twisted in knots, even as she held her composure. The memory of cross-examining Mr. Brody's fabricated witnesses, the sweaty handshake Alicia had given her after the final hearing, and Brody's outraged shouts as the officials took him away. All of it was still vividly etched in her mind. Those events were the seeds of everything Jade stood for now. She closed the file, set it gently back in a drawer, and turned off the desk lamp. Tomorrow would bring a fresh batch of challenges. More families in need, more unscrupulous landlords, more young lawyers to mentor. And Jade Harrison would be ready. On a bright spring morning, Jade awoke to the news that the state legislature had passed the Tenant Protection Act, bolstered by the public outcry her case had ignited. The law included tighter controls on eviction procedures, heavier penalties for fraudulent claims, and mandatory oversight for rent hikes in low-income districts. It was far from perfect, but it was a start, real progress that offered a lifeline to countless families. Helen, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, looked up from the newspaper. "Your name is in here again, Jade," she said with a laugh. "They called you the unstoppable force behind legislative change. Maybe they'll name a street after you one day." Jade nearly choked on her own coffee. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," she said, cheeks flushing. "I'm just glad people can stay in their homes without constant fear." Helen beamed. "You did something extraordinary. But don't forget to rest sometimes." Jade smiled and nodded. She knew she had to pace herself. This fight for justice wasn't a sprint. It was an unending marathon. Years later, people across the nation would recall the sensational story of an 18-year-old black teenager who walked into a courtroom and revealed she was a licensed attorney, turning a smug, mocking judge into a believer. They'd retell how she toppled a predatory landlord, exposing corruption and defending a mother and her children from unjust eviction. They would marvel at how that single act of courage rippled outward, fueling a broader wave of tenant rights activism, legislative reform, and countless lives improved. And at the center of this extraordinary movement was Jade Harrison, the quiet child prodigy with a spine of steel and a heart full of empathy. She remained committed to the same ideals that guided her from the beginning, using knowledge not for personal gain, but for uplifting those who lacked a voice. Challenges would never cease. Indeed, the deeper she fought against injustice, the more formidable adversaries she encountered. But Jade pressed forward with the unwavering conviction that even the mightiest walls could be dismantled if one refused to back down. And so, her story became a bright candle in the darkness, a testament to what any determined individual can achieve when they believe in justice, stay true to their values, and fight for the greater good. For as long as there were families like Alicia Carter's, desperate for help and living on the edge, Jade's mission remained clear. Keep the flame of hope burning, no matter how fierce the storms that tried to snuff it out. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Don't forget to turn on notifications. See you soon.